There is a particular kind of ache that has no obvious physical cause, that cannot be explained by hunger or fatigue or illness, and that most human beings have experienced at some point in their lives, the feeling of missing a place. Not missing a person exactly, though the two are often entangled. Missing the place itself, the specific quality of light in a childhood bedroom, the sound a particular door makes when it closes, the exact configuration of furniture in a room you have not seen in years, the smell of a specific kitchen, a feeling that can arrive with startling intensity when triggered by an unexpected sensory cue, a smell, a sound, a particular slant of afternoon light, and that can produce something close to grief for a place that, in many cases, is still standing, still exists, and could in principle be visited. This experience, homesickness, is so common and so universally recognized within human culture that it rarely receives the scientific attention its strangeness deserves. Why would a highly mobile species, a species that spent the overwhelming majority of its evolutionary history as nomadic hunter-gatherers moving across landscapes in search of resources, develop such a powerful psychological attachment to specific physical locations that separation from those locations produces genuine emotional distress? No other species, as far as researchers have been able to determine, exhibits anything closely resembling human homesickness. Migratory animals return to specific locations, but this appears to be driven by instinctual navigation systems, tied to breeding and resource availability, rather than anything resembling an emotional longing for a remembered place. Domestic animals separated from familiar environments can show distress, but this distress appears to track more closely with separation from familiar people and routines than with the loss of a specific physical location as such. Human homesickness, the specific psychological phenomenon of longing for a place independent of the people in it, appears to be a genuinely distinctive feature of human psychology. Understanding where this comes from and what it reveals about the human relationship to place turns out to illuminate something important about the deep structure of human memory, attachment, and identity. Let's begin with the psychological research on what homesickness actually is. The psychologist Miranda van Tilburg at Radboud University in the Netherlands, who has produced some of the most systematic research on homesickness available in the scientific literature, defines homesickness as a complex cognitive emotional response to the loss of a familiar environment, distinguished from simple nostalgia by its association with genuine psychological and physiological distress, including symptoms overlapping substantially with clinical depression. Preoccupying thoughts about the lost place, difficulty concentrating on present tasks, disrupted sleep, appetite changes, and a persistent low mood connected specifically to the separation from the familiar environment. Van Tilburg's research has documented that homesickness is not a monolithic experience, but involves several distinguishable psychological components. There is a cognitive component, involving intrusive and preoccupying thoughts about the lost place that interfere with the capacity to attend fully to the present environment. There is an emotional component involving genuine sadness, longing, and in severe cases, something closely resembling grief. And there is a physiological component involving elevated stress hormone levels and disrupted sleep patterns that mirror the physiological signature of other forms of psychological distress. What makes homesickness scientifically distinctive compared to other forms of separation distress that have been studied extensively in psychology is that its object is a place rather than a person. This raises the question of how a place, an inanimate arrangement of physical space, comes to function psychologically like an attachment figure, something whose absence can trigger a grief-like response. The environmental psychologist Harold Prashansky at the City University of New York, in a series of influential papers published in the 1970s and 1980s, proposed the concept of place identity to describe the specific psychological process through which physical environments become incorporated into a person's sense of self. Prashansky argued that human beings do not simply use physical environments instrumentally, as backdrops for action. They incorporate specific environments into their identity, such that the environment becomes part of the answer to the question of who they are. Prashansky's research found that place identity develops through a cumulative process of experience, in which the sensory, emotional, and behavioral associations built up through repeated interaction with a specific environment over time become woven into the person's broader self-concept. The childhood home, on this account, is not simply a location where formative experiences happen to occur. It becomes, through the cumulative process of place identity formation, a component of the self, such that separation from it can produce something that functions psychologically like a threat to identity rather than simply a change of scenery. This account helps explain why homesickness is often most acute not for recently left environments, but for environments associated with childhood and early life, periods during which place identity formation is most active and during which the cognitive and emotional systems that link environment to self are being most intensively constructed. The psychologist Setha Low at the City University of New York has extended this research to document that the specific environments most strongly associated with homesickness across cultures tend to be those associated with the highest density of formative emotional experience: family homes, childhood neighborhoods, and locations associated with significant life transitions. The neuroscience of how physical environments become encoded in memory in ways that can trigger such powerful emotional responses connects to research on what neuroscientists call place cells and the broader neural systems involved in spatial memory. The neuroscientist John O'Keefe at University College London, whose discovery of place cells in the hippocampus earned him the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 2014, documented that specific neurons in the hippocampus fire selectively when an animal occupies a specific location in a familiar environment, effectively creating a cognitive map of physical space that is encoded directly in the firing patterns of individual neurons. What is particularly significant for understanding homesickness is that the hippocampus, the brain region responsible for this spatial mapping function, is also centrally involved in autobiographical memory more broadly and is densely interconnected with the amygdala, the brain's primary emotional processing center. This anatomical arrangement means that the neural representation of a specific place is not stored in isolation from emotional and autobiographical information. It is stored in a system that is structurally positioned to bind spatial representations to emotional valence and personal narrative, which may explain why specific places can trigger such vivid and emotionally intense memories, and why the mental representation of a lost place can function, at the neural level, much like the mental representation of a lost relationship. The psychologist and memory researcher Christine Baccio at Lemoyne College has conducted extensive research specifically on nostalgia, the related but distinct emotional experience of longing for the past more generally, and has found that nostalgia and homesickness, while conceptually distinct, share substantial psychological and neurological overlap. Baccio's research has documented that nostalgic recall, including recall specifically triggered by place-related cues, activates reward-related brain regions alongside regions associated with autobiographical memory, suggesting that even painful separation from a beloved place carries within it a component of genuine pleasure, the pleasure of reconnecting, even if only in memory, with a meaningful period of one's own life. This finding, that nostalgia and by extension homesickness involve genuine positive affect alongside their more obviously painful components, has led Baccio and other researchers to reconceptualize homesickness not simply as a form of distress to be minimized, but as a psychologically functional process that serves important adaptive purposes, even though it is subjectively unpleasant to experience. The clinical psychologist Josh Klapow, who has studied the specific population of college students experiencing homesickness during the transition to university life, one of the most intensively studied populations for this phenomenon, because the transition is so common, sudden, and well-defined, has documented that homesickness serves what he characterizes as an important signaling and motivational function. The distress of homesickness motivates behaviors that, in the ancestral environment, would have been adaptive: maintaining contact with the home group, working actively to construct familiarity and belonging in the new environment, and preserving psychological continuity with one's identity and relationships during a period of significant environmental disruption. Klapow's research has found that homesickness, while distressing, is not simply a maladaptive response to be eliminated through simple behavioral distraction. Interventions that focus on validating the emotional significance of the lost environment and actively working to construct meaningful connection to the new environment produce better outcomes than interventions that simply encourage the homesick individual to distract themselves from their feelings about the place they have left. There is a further dimension of homesickness research that deserves careful attention because it addresses a puzzle that the attachment account alone does not fully resolve. Why homesickness varies so dramatically in intensity between individuals, and what factors determine whether a given separation from a familiar place produces mild wistfulness or genuinely debilitating distress. The psychologist Miriam van Vliet at the University of Utrecht has conducted extensive research on individual differences in homesickness vulnerability and has documented that the intensity of homesickness is predicted less by objective features of the situation, such as physical distance from home or duration of separation, and more by specific psychological characteristics of the individual experiencing it. Van Vliet's research found that individuals who score higher on measures of what she calls environmental dependency, the degree to which a person's sense of psychological stability relies on the presence of familiar physical surroundings rather than being internally generated, show substantially more severe homesickness symptoms when separated from home environments, independent of how attached they report being to specific people at home. This finding suggests that homesickness is not simply a function of how much a person loved their home environment, but of how much psychological work that environment was doing for them, a distinction that connects to a broader body of research on what environmental psychologists call restorative environments, physical settings that support psychological recovery and self-regulation. The environmental psychologist Rachel Kaplan at the University of Michigan, whose attention restoration theory has become foundational in environmental psychology, proposed that familiar environments serve an important cognitive function beyond their emotional significance. They reduce the cognitive load associated with constant environmental monitoring and threat assessment, allowing psychological resources to be directed toward other tasks. Kaplan's research found that unfamiliar environments impose what she calls directed attention fatigue, requiring continuous effortful attention to navigate successfully, in ways that familiar environments, which can be navigated largely automatically based on well-established mental maps, do not require. This finding provides an additional and complementary account of why homesickness produces genuine cognitive and emotional depletion. The homesick individual is not simply missing an emotionally significant place. They are also, quite literally, expending additional cognitive resources simply to function in an unfamiliar environment that a familiar environment would not have required, a burden that compounds the emotional distress of separation with genuine cognitive fatigue. The cross-cultural dimension of homesickness has been documented extensively by the psychologist Colleen Ward at Victoria University of Wellington, whose research on the psychology of cultural adjustment and what is sometimes called culture shock has found that homesickness intensity varies systematically with what she calls cultural distance, the degree of difference between the home culture and the new environment in terms of language, social norms, and everyday practices. Ward's research found that homesickness in the context of international relocation is substantially predicted by the degree to which the new environment fails to provide the culturally specific cues and social scripts that the individual has spent a lifetime learning to navigate automatically, adding a cultural dimension to the cognitive load account that Kaplan's research on environmental familiarity identifies at the level of physical space. This cross-cultural research also illuminates an important developmental dimension of homesickness. The phenomenon appears to be substantially more intense and more common during specific life transitions associated with major changes in social role and environmental context, including the transition to university, military deployment, immigration, and other circumstances involving sudden and involuntary separation from established environments and social networks. The consistency of this pattern across such different circumstances suggests that homesickness is not a specialized response to any one particular kind of separation, but a general-purpose psychological system that activates whenever an individual experiences significant discontinuity between the environment that has shaped their sense of self and the environment they currently occupy. The evolutionary account of why humans, uniquely among animals, develop this capacity for place-based attachment and separation distress remains somewhat speculative, but the leading hypothesis connects homesickness to the broader evolutionary account of human attachment psychology, developed originally by John Bowlby in his foundational work on attachment theory. Bowlby proposed that the human infant attachment system, the psychobiological system that creates powerful emotional bonds between infants and caregivers, and that produces intense distress upon separation, evolved because infant survival in the ancestral environment depended critically on maintaining proximity to protective caregivers. The anthropologist and attachment researcher Patricia Draper, who has studied attachment patterns across a range of traditional human societies, has proposed that the same psychological machinery that evolved to bind infants to caregivers may have been extended, over the course of human cognitive evolution, to bind individuals to the physical and social environment of the group more broadly. In the ancestral environment, separation from one's home group and home territory was not simply an emotional inconvenience. It represented a genuine and serious threat to survival, involving the loss of the accumulated local knowledge required to find food and water, the loss of the social network required for cooperative defense and resource sharing, and the loss of the protective presence of kin and allies. On this account, the psychological pain of homesickness is not a random or accidental byproduct of human cognitive complexity. It is a specific evolutionary adaptation, an extension of the same attachment machinery that binds infants to caregivers, repurposed to bind adults to the physical and social environment on which their survival historically depended. The intensity of the emotional response, its capacity to interfere with concentration and mood and sleep in ways that mirror clinical depression, reflects the genuine evolutionary stakes that were once attached to separation from one's home territory and home group. What makes this account particularly compelling is that it explains a feature of homesickness that would otherwise be puzzling: why the experience is often most intense, not simply for any lost location, but specifically for locations associated with social belonging, family, and the accumulated history of one's own life. A hotel room checked out of after a pleasant vacation rarely produces homesickness, however comfortable it may have been, because it lacks the accumulated density of social attachment and personal history that characterizes the environments that reliably trigger the experience. Homesickness, properly understood, is not really about missing a place in the abstract. It is about missing a place that has become woven into the fabric of one's identity and social belonging, in a manner directly continuous with the attachment bonds that, in infancy, first taught the developing human brain that safety and survival depend on proximity to what is familiar. There is one more piece of evidence worth examining, because it comes from a direction that at first seems unrelated to homesickness, but that ultimately illuminates why the human relationship to place is so distinctive among animal species: the archaeological and anthropological evidence for the emergence of what researchers call territorial attachment in human prehistory. The archaeologist Ian Hodder at Stanford University, whose extensive excavation work at the Neolithic site of Çatalhöyük in Turkey has provided some of the richest evidence available about the psychology of early settled human communities, has documented that human beings appear to have developed distinctive practices of attachment to specific dwellings and locations that intensified dramatically with the transition from nomadic to settled ways of life beginning roughly 12,000 years ago. Hodder's research at Çatalhöyük found evidence that individual households maintained continuous occupation of specific dwelling structures across multiple generations, rebuilding directly on top of previous structures in a manner that preserved spatial continuity, and that the dead were frequently buried beneath the floors of the homes in which the living continued to reside, creating a direct and continuous physical link between specific locations and specific family lineages across time. This archaeological evidence suggests that the psychological machinery underlying homesickness, whatever its ultimate evolutionary origin in the attachment systems that predate settled life, found a particularly powerful and consequential expression once human beings began to occupy specific locations continuously across generations rather than moving nomadically across a broader territory. The anthropologist Tim Ingold at the University of Aberdeen has proposed that this transition fundamentally reshaped the human relationship to place, from what he calls a dwelling perspective, in which meaning and identity are continuously generated through movement across a familiar but not singularly fixed landscape, to a more concentrated form of place attachment, in which a specific bounded location becomes the primary anchor of identity and belonging. Ingold's analysis suggests an important refinement to the evolutionary account of homesickness. While the underlying attachment machinery that makes place-based emotional bonds possible may be very ancient, tracing back to the infant attachment systems that predate the emergence of modern humans entirely, the specific intensity and character of modern homesickness, oriented around attachment to singular, bounded, continuously occupied locations, such as a particular house or hometown, may be a considerably more recent cultural and psychological development, emerging alongside the broader transition to settled agricultural life and the forms of property, inheritance, and multi-generational residence that this transition made possible. This refinement matters because it helps explain why homesickness, while apparently universal across contemporary human cultures, may have taken a specific and intensified form only in the relatively recent portion of human history during which most human beings began to live in fixed dwellings rather than moving across a broader home range. The psychological capacity for place attachment is very old. The specific cultural and environmental conditions that make modern homesickness, oriented around leaving a specific fixed home, such a common and intensely felt experience, may be considerably younger, a product of the same transition to settled life that gave rise to agriculture, private property, and the accumulated multi-generational history that Hodder's excavations at Çatalhöyük reveal being deliberately and physically preserved within the walls of a single, continuously occupied home. The migratory bird that returns to the same nesting ground year after year is following a genetically programmed navigational system, indifferent to the specific history of that particular patch of ground beyond its objective suitability for breeding. The human being who feels a genuine ache at the thought of a childhood home they will never live in again is experiencing something categorically different: the activation of an attachment system that has bound the self, quite literally at the level of neural architecture, to a specific place that has become inseparable from the story of who they are. What all of this research collectively suggests is that homesickness sits at the intersection of ancient and recent evolutionary history, drawing on an attachment system many hundreds of thousands of years old, while being expressed, in its modern form, through a relationship to fixed dwellings and hometowns that only became the dominant human experience within the last several thousand years, an eye blink in the timescale of the deeper psychological machinery it activates. That ache is not sentimentality. It is one of the oldest and most fundamental systems in the human mind, doing exactly what it evolved to do, reminding you, with whatever force it has available, that you once belonged somewhere, and that the belonging mattered enough to be worth missing. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next video. If you find this video interesting, please consider subscribing for more content like this.